Okay, well, welcome to the second of the speaker series for Ohio University's REU program and the RISE program at Nationwide Children's Hospital, directed by Dr. Fran Wims and Dr. Eric Youngstrom, respectively. Our speaker today is Dr. Andy Frey, who's a professor of social work at the University of Missouri, and he's going to begin today's meeting by telling all of us about some of the cool work that he's doing there. And then there'll be a period of time for questions and answers. And as I prompted all of you last week, you certainly can ask him about the work that he presents, but you can also ask him about all kinds of things about why he chose to go into what he is doing and how he ended up where he is, and advice for grad students, and all those kinds of cool things as well. The time for these questions will be at the end, so don't interrupt him during his presentation. And when we do get to questions, remember to use the little hand that is at the top of your screen that says raise under it, that indicates you want to say something, and I'll call on people so we keep it going in a semi-orderly fashion. So Andy, you want to introduce yourself a bit and then you can get started?
I would love to do that. Thank you very much for the introduction. As Steve said, my name is Andy Frey, and I am at the University of Missouri. I'm located in the School of Social Work here, and fortunate to work with a number of colleagues at the Missouri Prevention Science Institute that represents multiple disciplines. So all my work is really interdisciplinary, based in educational settings. I tend to lean towards younger populations. I've done a lot in preschool and Head Start, and some in early kindergarten as well, as far as my intervention based work, and then have a broader research agenda that is school mental health more generally. And so one line of research is, and probably the one that I like to do and talk about the most, is related to motivational interviewing, which is a clinical counseling practice and that started in substance abuse about 3 decades ago and has, well, I guess sort of slowly, because it's taken that long, but everything happens slow when you're translating from science to practice. So I'm not sure it's slower than any of the other translations that I'm familiar with, but has been in educational settings for, I guess, about a decade, and really increasing pretty rapidly. My take on this audience is that you're combination of undergrad and graduate and probably multiple disciplines represented. Is that true?
Yes.
Some head nods, very good. And so I tried to put something together which was also a good fit for me, that has a little bit of clinical in it and a little bit of research as well, imagining that people are headed in both of those directions, even though you might not exactly know what directions. All right, I see some head nods, like, yep, sounds like I've got a decent read on the group. Yeah, so am I gonna be able to see a show of hands? And I guess I've got about half yet. Anybody familiar with motivational interviewing as a practice? All right, cool. All right, good. I'm right on. Very good. So very thin, right, given our timeline in all of these areas, but let me see if I can share a screen here. I'm going to float out the agenda, and then I'll see if there's any questions or anything that anybody is particularly interested in, because I can modify this and spend more and less time on things. I would like to accommodate the interests of the group. And I'm assuming I can share.
Yeah, I believe so. There you go.
All right, you're seeing that?
Yep.
And Let me see if I can get that sized. There we go. Looking like a full screen, right?
Yep.
All right, awesome. So here is the plan. I am gonna talk a little bit about motivational interviewing, a very brief overview of the skills that are associated with that practice, and then I'm going to go into some of the I call it mechanisms of motivational interviewing, but really another word for like the logic model or the theory behind it. So I've underlined here a couple of the themes that are related to the research piece of this and how research fits in to this agenda that I'm going to describe. So that'll address kind of the theory which guides some of the research. And then I'm going to introduce briefly an intervention called Home Base. It's based on motivational interviewing that was created in a team that I'm part of from 2008 to 2015. It's a home-based intervention with parents of children, young children who have some behavioral challenges. And then after I describe that intervention, go into two different related lines of research that are very connected to the theory that I'll describe. So going to look at how we measure motivational interviewing quality, and that's a form of fidelity within our research, how well they do that particular practice. And then right hot off the press, I've been involved in this client commitment language coding for about a year and a half, and we just got to a very pivotal place, and I'm going to share a little bit about that coding system and what that looks like. With that as a backdrop, any particular things that people are interested in hearing more or less about, or anything else you think that I should know before I launch off here into this presentation? All right. I'm messing with my screen and I'm on two screens. Can I assume that if anything on your screen changed, you would have let me know? Still see the presentation?
Yep. You're still set.
All right, awesome. Okay, so this is history on motivational interviewing. I acknowledge that it's been around for about 30 years. Steve Miller and Bill Rolnick are the founders of that practice. There's been 4 iterations of the main textbook for it. The last one just came out last year. And as far as school-based applications, there's a number of ways that people are using motivational interviewing. 3 general categories. One is just in everyday conversations, right? So in school, motivational interviewing is a way to have a conversation about change. And it just so happens that a lot of people in schools, including school social workers, school counselors, school psychologists, administrators, we do a lot of time having conversations about change. And so it is a good skill set to have if you engage in others in conversations around change. Most of my applications have been with teachers to get them to change their behaviors, parents to get them to potentially change their behaviors, and it can also be used directly with youth, generally adolescents or above. And so we do a lot of, there's a lot of training on motivational interviewing that are just around the skill set that aren't attached to any particular purpose or intervention, just kind of general conversations that you have. And there's a whole nother category around consultation and coaching. And so that involves conversations with teachers and parents when you're trying to assist them in a problem-solving process. Motivational interviewing has a pretty unique place in that practice. It's similar to a lot of other consultation models, but there's also some very unique pieces to it. And then the third area is intervention development. Some people have used motivational interviewing as a framework to design interventions from the ground up, and that is the case for the home base intervention that I'm going to describe. So generally, when that happens, the intervention procedures follow the tasks that I'll describe in motivational interviewing from a process standpoint, and it is believed, and one of the aspects of the intervention is that if you implement it well, you will be using motivational interviewing skills at a pretty high level. So there's the history. And here's a definition. Motivational interviewing is a collaborative, goal-oriented style of communication with particular attention to the language of change. It is designed to strengthen personal motivation for and commitment to a specific goal by listening and exploring the person's own reasons for change within an atmosphere of acceptance and compassion. And a couple of things just to highlight about that really make motivational interviewing unique, that you'll hopefully hear as I go through some of the foundational concepts of it. And the theory is, one is attention to the language of change. So the language that the other person that you're talking with uses is really informative for what you will do then next as an interventionist or as a clinician. And also that the words that they use tell us a lot about their readiness for change, or how likely they are to actually engage in the change that's being discussed. And then another piece to highlight, designed to strengthen personal motivation for or commitment to a specific goal by highlighting their reasons for change. So one of the things that's I think is pretty unique about motivational interviewing is if you're getting closer to change, the interventionist can't be the one that's arguing for it. Your job is to get on the other side of that conversation and get the person that you're talking with to talk favorably about change. The idea being the more favorably one talks about change, the more likely they actually are to engage in it. Everybody good with me? Sweet. Okay, I'm gonna hit just a couple of the core components of motivational interviewing. It takes a lot to learn this practice. When we do our trainings, what we've learned is that it's to get somebody in general to be implementing this practice with a high level of fidelity. They're participating in roughly 10 hours of didactic learning and practice, and a few people can go on from there and actually do this well, but the vast majority of people need that and some individualized feedback where they are actually practicing and then they're getting feedback on that practice from somebody that's well-versed in the practice. So as the basic overview, the things that we cover in these trainings and help people learn to practice effectively, you've got the spirit, the skills, and the processes. And those processes have in the recent version are now called tasks, and I caught that in the later slide, but I didn't catch it in this slide. So the spirit, the skills, and tasks. The spirit: partnership, acceptance, compassion, empowerment. It's a very person-centered practice, very consistent with like Carl Rogers' client-centered practice approach or stance, or the posture we take with the people that we are working with. And so briefly, these pieces of these components of the spirit, that partnership, that it is something that we're doing together, and we're not doing anything. We're not motivational interviewing them. It's not a verb. We're not using this as a tool to get people to do what we think that they should do. Although it could be used poorly in that way, it might be effective, but it wouldn't be motivational interviewing. It would be something sneaky and different. Acceptance is the notion that no matter what people are engaged in behavior-wise, or their attitudes or their beliefs, they probably have a pretty good reason for why they're there, and it only benefits us and helps us to develop a relationship if we accept that and really take a curious stance and try to understand where they're coming from and why they are there. And it's very different than agreement. It doesn't mean that we agree with them. It just means that we accept where they are and are curious, particularly if we don't understand, and that tends to be helpful for relationships. Compassion is that we have to be working towards goals that are theirs. So one of the things that we do early on in the engagement process in motivational interviewing is try to learn about one's values and the goals that they have. Because if we know about their values and their goals, and we're confident we're talking about behaviors that are consistent with those values and goals, then it's okay to use the skills in a directional fashion that intentionally moves them towards them. We're not trying to get them to do something that's inconsistent with their goals and their values, but as long as we're pretty sure we know, we have a good understanding of what they want and what would be how they could live consistently with how they want to be, then it's okay to use these skills in a way that intentionally moves them towards change. Empowerment is the notion that we're giving them something that they didn't previously have. So one of the hallmarks of the posture, the way we approach people and problem solving, is that people are experts on their own lives. As a clinician, I might be expert on helping people navigate problems, but I never try to claim that I know more about their lives or what is better for them than they do. So the empowerment is just the process of helping them get somewhere. They already know the answers, but sometimes they need help getting to different places because they're stuck for one reason or another. Skills are open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. So almost everything that an interventionist or clinician says can be categorized in one of these ways, and actually almost everything can be a question or a reflection. Affirmations and summaries are usually subcategories of those reflections, and obviously these are, some of these are pretty straightforward, and if we were in person, I'd say, tell me what you think this is, and you'd probably be right about a lot of it. This is these practices, with the exception of reflections, are present in most clinical counseling approaches in some form or fashion. And then the tasks, previously those were called processes, are can also think about them as steps. They're sort of linear, but not exactly linear. So for example, you always start with engaging, right? But particularly in the beginning of a relationship with someone, it's very important to start with engaging, because there's the belief, again, consistent with many other practices, that no good work happens unless there is a good relationship. So that engaging piece is critical. The second piece is focusing. That is usually when you're talking about change. Sometimes it's pretty narrow and clear, and other times there's like a million things going on, and it's impossible to do the third task, which is evoking, unless you and the other person are really clear on what is actually what's the target behavior. So there's the engaging, then there's focusing, then once you have that topic of focusing, evoking comes along, which is uniquely motivational interviewing. This is the process by which we attempt, assuming what we're talking about, the behavior change we're talking about, is consistent with their values and their goals. Then you move into evoking, which is getting them to articulate their own motivations and desires to engage in a different behavior. And then you move on to planning, and that is where the focusing is really narrow, so you can get oftentimes as specific enough as a treatment plan or a goal on paper. And so those are the tasks, sort of linear. Engaging always happens first. Planning is towards the end, but we always have the ability to cycle back, and focusing and evoking happen because the focus usually starts broad and goes down to narrow and sometimes changes over the course of a relationship. That is a much more fluid process. So those are the nuts and bolts of that right there's your 12 hours of training in about 4 or 5, maybe 6 minutes. Questions, comments, thoughts before I switch to kind of theory and get into some of the research stuff? All right. Steve, now's when you say they didn't have any questions last week, Andy. This is not a reflection on their interest or your engaging presentation style.
Yeah, but I think it might be, so I wasn't going to say that. You do have a hand up, though, actually. So,
yay,
Alicia.
Yeah, I was curious. So you talked about in the beginning with motivational interviewing how you're like paying really close attention to the language that the person uses, and like how that can be an indicator that someone is ready for change. And I was curious like how you navigate that when someone is not like in their own words, it doesn't seem like they're ready or that they like want to engage in change.
Got it. So how does if I'm understanding the question, if I'm hearing based on what they're saying that they're not ready for change, or this is not something that they see as, that they're ready for, how does that influence what I do? Is that the question?
Yeah, like either they're not ready or they don't want to and like start changing their habits.
Yeah, so the speed at which you can move the influence is how fast can you move that conversation, right? If they are talking in ways that are not favorable to change, and so the general categories for that is change talk, sustain talk, right? Anything that is favorable for change, we call change talk. Anything that is anti-change or pro-status quo, we would categorize as sustain talk. And so what you're saying, I think, that is if you have a lot of sustain talk, so somebody is articulating, their desire, the, reasons not to change, questioning their own ability to do it. If they're doing those things, then I want to focus on relationship and really take time to understand why they are where they are. Because maybe I'll hear that and I'll be like, boy, that makes total sense, and getting them to change doesn't really, I'm like, wow, you're right on. Sometimes, and not all change you can weigh equally, right? So you can use this practice and not really have an investment in change. So I'll use an example. If I'm talking with a teacher and they're super stressed out and they're trying to, decide whether or not they want to stay in the profession or get out of it, I would probably explore their ambivalence equally, because who am I to, have a dog in that fight, right? Maybe it's that getting out is the best thing for them. And my job is really just to help them process and really think thoughtfully around all those. So I might not be interested in moving the conversation forward. If I'm talking to a teacher about whether or not they should be screaming at a kid in the middle of class, I'm probably going to have a different take and I would on that. And so I would attend to the relationship. And then if I thought that you really needed to press, I would press a little harder, even though that's relationally risky, knowing that I might be getting close to the end of the rope, because I'm just trying, but I'm not ready to give up yet. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for asking. All right. And thanks for telling me their hand was raised, Steve. I think I've only got half this in view, so I'm not sure I'll see them if they do.
Yeah, sure.
All right, so here's the theory piece, right? Almost all research is informed by theory, and the research that I'm going to share right after this is informed by this particular theory, and that is up top, we train people to use that motivation, to use those skills in didactic workshops. Then we do the coaching and feedback, and then they're generally in the practice where they're implementing whatever they're implementing, where motivational interviewing is designed to be used. Then, are you seeing the cursor? Do you see the cursor too, or not see it? Okay, cool.
Yes. Yep.
Great. So initial training then leads to motivational interviewing competency. This is, can somebody use these skills in a contrived setting? So we're staging the setting. They're either in role play, or they're interacting with a video, or in written format. And then as you get towards the actual intervention, you are assessing motivational interviewing skill within the applied practice. So as they're actually doing the intervention. And then there's, in theory, and evidence supports it, strong use of motivational interviewing or high implementation fidelity impacts how they talk about the change. So if I'm using motivational interviewing well, it should influence the extent to which they talk favorably or negative or unfavorably about change, ideally resolving that ambivalence as identified by more change talk, less sustained talk. And then more change talk, less sustained talk then leads to actual behavior change, whatever it is, whatever the target of that behavior is. So there's the theory. We recently did a scoping review. If you're not familiar with it, it's a systematic review of the literature that looks at a particular topic. We looked at school-based applications of motivational interviewing, found 62 articles, primarily within the last decade. You can see that they're implemented in largely secondary settings, but some in preschool and some in elementary, a variety of implementers, and the participant students more often than not, but also some with teachers and with parents. The home-based intervention is approximately 3 to 5 home visits. I mentioned that we're screening in schools for kids in kindergarten through 3rd grade whose parents and teachers have indicated that they have some challenging behavior. And this is an interventionist trained pretty heavily in motivational interviewing to go through a process that starts off with engagement. We're using a values discovery and a semi-structured interview to get to know what's important to them and their values. Then we're moving into an interview. These are generally session-by-session interviews where the parent does some self-reflecting, guided self-reflecting on 5 parenting principles, positive parenting. And so having consistent expectations, teaching those expectations directly, reinforcing those expectations when you see them, minimizing attention to negative behavior, and having consistent consequences. So those are the targets of potential targets of behavior, and we have parents do some self-assessment around that. Then we have them play the game of Jenga with their child, and we video record it. And if you're familiar with the game, even if you say you're an awesome and super supportive and loving parent, it's really hard to do that in the process of a game of Jenga. So it's just, it gives us a little leverage if, since this is self-assessment, if we get a parent that says, oh yeah, I do that, I do that, I do that, I do that, and then you get into a situation and it looks very different, it just gives you a little bit of leverage to not give up quite yet and just say, all right, awesome. But if it is awesome, you do say, hey, that's awesome. And so then performance feedback, and then another session where they, if they're interested, choose one or more of those target areas. And then you move into the planning phase where they set some goals, and a couple more sessions where you're trying to identify routines that are challenging for them and their child, and practicing those one or more skills in the context of those routines. And then there's a closure. And I can't copy and paste this right now because I can't access it while I'm live in this presentation. But afterwards, there's a little video that there wasn't time, and my audio is not good running video through the system. So I'll put it in the chat. It's about an 8-minute video in case anybody wants to see a little bit about that intervention. So the research pieces that we do related to fidelity and related to client commitment language, I think is pretty interesting. So what we do is we audio record all the sessions between the interventionist and the parent, and we take those and have them externally coded by somebody who does a lot of this, and they will randomly identify a start time in it, and then give us a 20-minute random 20-minute segment from the interview. Then they code that, and they're looking at a couple of different things. These are the summary scores. They're looking at the relational skills. So these are global indicators of global, meaning they're just on a Likert scale of 1 through 5 with some pretty, clear anchors and definitions related to the extent that they had a partnership with the parent and that they showed empathy. Then their technical skills, again, this is on a 1 to 5 scale. Technical skills are the combination of, did they cultivate change talk, and did they soften sustained talk? So did they use these skills strategically or directionally to influence change towards the influence the conversation towards change? Then complex reflections, so percent of complex reflections. I didn't get into the weeds on reflections, but there's 2 different kinds, complex and simple. They're both good. Complex are better. So we're looking for, these are what the benchmarks, these are what you're shooting for. 40% complex reflections to simple reflections is good. 50% is this advanced proficiency. And then another thing that is important is the ratio of reflections to questions, where equal is good and 2 to 1 reflections to questions, which is a really high bar, particularly since people are generally trained to ask questions. So to do more reflecting than questions is usually the hardest thing to get people to do. So those are the metrics that they use when they audio record those, when they code those audio recorded conversations. And this is in our most recent study, a home base with over about 250 audio recordings and about 20 different interventionists. And you can see that pretty large percentage of those coaches within those tapes are hitting the basic proficiency and did pretty well on this one, not quite as high on this advanced proficiency. These are really high bars. This takes a lot to get people to those. So we found these to be very encouraging. And then back to here, so there's been a lot on proficiency. There's been a lot less in the research about how to capture change talk and actually connecting MI proficiency to change talk and then change talk to behavior change. So that's what we've been trying to get our head around for about the last year. And we took these same audio recordings. We have the motivational interviewing proficiency data, and we wanted to examine the relationship between MI proficiency and parent change talk across sessions, and then look at parent change talk and whether or not it impacted parent and student outcomes, because we already have that data as part of this study. So the missing piece is this one here, and it's really hard to get. There's not too many people that have great systems for capturing change talk. So we used existing code book that had been used by Dr. Maggie Sibley, who is also the one that does our proficiency coding. And she has done this in some other applications successfully. So after we failed at this for about 6 months, we took a step back. We went back to her and said, what are we doing wrong? And she said, well, one, it's just really hard. And two, you're welcome to try my system. And I've got a really good coder who actually knows your intervention well because was part of the team that coded that might help you out. So we brought Erica on board and have been working, she has been working with our team for about 6 months now. And simultaneously, we got some money to try to develop an online system to facilitate this coding. And so here's the system, but I'm going to zip out of this because I can show you the system. Let me pause. And do I have about, if I go another 7, 8, 9 minutes, Steve, are we okay? Or you want me to pause and go?
No, that's fine. Another 7, 8, 9 minutes is fine. Also, just for those of you on the call, he kept referring to Maggie Sibley, and you may note she is a speaker later in the speaker series this summer, so you'll be hearing from her as well a little later.
Great. Any questions, comments, thoughts before I zip onto this system? Julie, I can't wait for you to see this.
Now we can all get into the University of Missouri system.
Oh yeah, this is you have to get through all our firewalls. This is highly protected information here. All right, so this is me as a coder. So there's an administrative login and then there's a coder login, and I wanted to show you how this works here. Recently assigned, available. All right, so I'm getting into this audio, right? So this is one of our 20-minute segments of audio, and we run the audio, and because I have my headphones on, you can't hear the audio, but it is the conversation between the interventionist and the parent. And then volley breaks, super important. So how we, one of the decision rules for this, and one of the hardest things for us to get our head around, and one of the reasons we failed miserably in our first 8 months of trying this is because we didn't understand volley breaks, is segments of the interview are divided into components of speech, and a volley break is a little bit more complicated, but essentially every time a speaker changes, okay? And within volleys, we can, within volleys, you have to assign one code, but you can't assign, and you can assign multiple codes, but you can't assign the same code more than one time. And so the first thing we do is we have somebody go and give all these, assign the volley breaks so that the people who are coding it know where those breaks are, so that they know those rules. In between each volley break, there has to be one code. There can be more than one code, but there can't be the same code 2 times. So that's how the volley breaks go. Then for the code options within those volley breaks, you've got a no code, which means that you can't understand what they're saying, or the interventionist isn't talking to the parent. Then you've got the conversation. This is all parent speech that we're coding, so we're only coding the parent speech here. Not parenting means they're not talking about parenting. Other parenting means they're talking about parenting, but they're not talking about one of those 5 targets, one of those 5 universal principles. If it's about parenting and talking about one of those 5 universal parenting principles, you can give it a CT for change talk or an ST for sustained talk. And then tags, which are not codes, they just represent those 5 universal principles. So they help us understand what is being talked about. So if there's a change talk, it's usually followed by a 1 or more of these, or maybe they're talking about all of them. So that's how we do that coding. And once you code it, the timestamp it gives you a timestamp down at the bottom, and all that data can be exported into an Excel file and analyzed. And having this online means that multiple people can be on the system and coding, and even coding the same audio. And then we also get all of that dropped into the same Excel file. And so this team's been working together, and it's mostly students from different disciplines here for a long time, trying to get reliable. And just this past week, yesterday in fact, here's our coders, right? These are the last 12 that we've done. So everybody did all of them. And Jason Small, who's been doing our analysis and trying to slow me down so that when we get to the end, we have something that is worth publishing, has run all of our reliability. So kappa is a statistic that tells you inter-rater reliability. How much do they agree? So these are, we have a gold standard. Erica is our gold standard. That was Maggie's coder, who knows, a lot more than we do about this and has a lot more experience. She's our gold standard. Here's all of our other coders, and benchmarks vary. 0.8 is awesome. 0.7 is pretty good by most standards. 0.6 could cut mustard for some people. And we're using 2 measures. One is a kappa, one's an adjusted kappa, which controls for different sizes in our cells. So sometimes we'll code and there won't be very much sustained talk. So getting reliable when you only have like 3 or 4 instances of sustained talk is really tough. So this adjusted kappa accounts for variable variances in cell sizes, and it runs quite a bit higher than this. But basically, Jason gave us this and said, all right, I think these 3, our bar should be 0.7 over the last 6 tapes. These 3 are ready to go. These 2 need a little bit more work, and so we just kind of turned the corner on this project with these 3 going independently coding, and these 2 having to do a few more before we cut them loose. That's my spiel.
Thank you, Andy. That's fascinating. I think it's a great opportunity for everyone to see one line of research that looks at counseling or psychotherapy or whatever involves just looking at such a molecular level about everything you say as a clinician and how that fits into the model of care you're providing. One thing, if I would like to ask the first question, I don't see any hands up quite yet, but could you tell us a little bit like what has been found in that last connection of your model? So essentially it's the question, why does this matter? What do we learn from this that can help make a difference for parents and kids?
Yeah, great question. So the entire theory of motivational interviewing is based on the assumption that how one talks about change is directly related to whether or not they actually change. And so until you really establish that empirically, the notion that motivational interviewing is even good, even if you're doing it well, is kind of has a missing link to it. Like we know that it's good, but we don't know why it's good. Like, is it really because it influences how people talk? And if it does, then that's what it all becomes about, is influencing how people talk about change. And if you were really to establish that further than we have already, like there's some literature for it, but it's not super robust yet. It really might have implications for practices far beyond motivational interviewing. That's one way to influence how people change, and it's organized around that principle. But heck, somebody might have other ways to influence how people change that are how people talk about change that are just as good or better. So it has implications for how clinicians are trained. It has implications for what the goal of a conversation about change is, if you can really establish that as a super strong link and know the ins and outs of it. Is it just about increasing change talk, or is it more about resolving the ratio of change and sustained talk? Maybe it's just about reducing sustained talk and doesn't have anything to do with more change talk. So all those things are relevant, and all of them would have implications for how this kind of work impacts the quality of people's lives and how they behave.
Thank you. That's great. Do you have any specific examples of where you found connections between things you've coded and how it affected the teachers or the clients or whatever context it is in?
Nothing hardcore data-wise, because we've been so focused on getting this piece down.
Yeah.
But I've listened to a ton of these audio recordings now. And like one of my takeaways is, gosh, I wish I would have done more of this, easy to say, because it takes so much time. But like now I was managing this whole project, and there was a lot going on I didn't know about, both good and not so good, that I wish I would have known. But I like intuitively, this completely makes sense to me. Like when I hear a lot of change talk and I hear interventionists that are good at motivational interviewing, it seems to me pretty clear that it influences how people talk about change, and how they talk about change seems like it's super important. Like you can just hear it in their inflection, and it seems like they're much more likely to go do something when they're talking favorably about it and all fired up. But we haven't put those pieces together for this. Some people have put that together, but it's mostly been around substance abuse, and it hasn't been that much.
Right. Also for you students, a lot of this motivational interviewing work in terms of how it affects consultation with teachers, Julie Owens does. And actually, Julie, who's here, also works with Maggie Sibley, who does a lot of the coding for her project as well. So if you're interested in, those of you in the Ohio University REU program, especially since you're here, if you're interested in learning more about some of that, she'd be a great resource. Raise your hand if you have a question for Andy, and if not, I'm going to ask my generic discipline one. A lot of students are looking at various career paths, and a lot of them for both RISE program and the REU have a current interest, professed interest in research of various types. One of the less common examples that, myself included, we hear about in terms of researchers in this area of work is social workers. If they were interested in a social work career, but a research-oriented one, I mean, they can find 100 MSW programs, but how do they connect with a social work program that could get them on a path similar to what yours is, which is has a significant research piece to it?
So I guess I would probably, assuming you have mobility and, the resources to kind of pick and choose a program that you would be interested in, I would probably start by looking at the faculty in that program and make sure that there's somebody who's doing the kind of work that you would eventually like to do, and maybe even reach out to that person before you apply, or at least before you get there. And I assure you, they will be surprised that somebody who hasn't even entered an MSW program is asking about their, wondering what their opportunities will be like for research should they get there. And there aren't too many researchers that I know that wouldn't be super fired up to have a conversation with somebody about that topic. So I would look at faculty and reach out and try to have a conversation and see what opportunities are there. Of course, you're going to have more funded opportunities in general in place in, our research intensive universities that have a lot of research going on. And it's true that there's not as much in social work as there is in some of the other disciplines.
Thank you, Andy.
Who wants to come to Missouri?
Well, that's actually would be one example. Are there what other social work programs besides Missouri do you know that for child and adolescent work, they have a research productive social work department?
So the big ones is going to be University of Chicago, North Carolina, and let's see, University of Washington, WashU in St. Louis. Missouri is definitely middle tier social work, but as far as education research, we're in very good shape. Let's see, what are some of the Brown schools? Is University of Washington, Michigan, absolutely. University of Illinois is pretty strong, and a lot of those programs are going to be strong in child welfare because that's the biggest area of research. And so if you're in child welfare, any of those will probably work. If you're in other areas, you might have to do a little bit more swimming, and if anybody actually goes there and I can be helpful, I'd be happy to.
Great. Other questions? Faculty, students? Okay. Oh, Julie has a question.
Yeah, I was trying to be quiet because I didn't want to take up airspace when any students want to chat, because I could chat with Andy about so many things. But Andy, what I think your work really shows on one hand how challenging it is to bring people to proficiency with MI. And at the same time, there are, a lot of sort of clinical micro skills within that may really make a difference in potentially in moving the needle, in clinical practice or with teachers or families. So I'm just wondering if you could just chat a little bit about, do you think we only get the benefit if we fully get to proficiency? What do we think about MI light and training skills? Can we do it? I don't know. Just talk about that.
Oh man, there's the $64 million question right there. Like, how good is good enough, right?
Yeah, I guess.
Gosh, I wish I knew. I wish I knew.
Do you want to
I don't
take out
think
your
there's
discussions?
I don't think there's like a bar, I don't
Yeah.
think there's like a if you're here. I think it's all incremental. And I am a big believer in the practice, and so I think so MI light, like the one way I think about MI light is really more of a focus on the relational piece and just how you are with people, but not really looking at and counting skills and the ratio of those skills and whether or not you're using those skills directionally to influence change. I would actually call that not really MI, like that. I mean, I would, it's got some overlap, but I don't know how that would be too much different than anybody else who was just trained in, good old school client-centered counseling. So I do think there is real value in the technical application of it.
Yeah.
And maybe before I'll die, I'll have some evidence of that.
And I'll cite you, I promise.
Thanks, Andy. Lindsay?
Andy,
Hi, I'm Lily. Hopefully you can hear me.
Oh.
I was wondering about different I guess contexts and environments for motivational interviewing, because I use and was trained in that through a health and wellness coach certification, and I work as a wellness coach at my school with students. So I was just kind of wondering how that format or setting would be different than more of a clinical setting, and the approaches and just kind of how it looks.
Yeah, great question. So how it would actually get measured, there's really no difference that I know of. Like, the mighty is the gold standard, and that, the skills are the skills, and how we capture them and talk about whether or not somebody is using it at a moderate level or a very high level. There's no difference in how those would get recorded. And I can say more about this, about the difference between a school-based application than a clinical application. And so then maybe you can share a little bit about yours, and we can, put those pieces together. I don't know which one is yours. Yours is more like. So in a clinical application, you usually have, close to 1 hour, and it's one-on-one, and you're in an office. And those aren't the kind of conversations you generally have with school people in schools. If you get 20 minutes with a teacher, you did really well. And it can end at any second. When we work with parents, we're usually in a home setting. The TV's on, the phone's ringing 3 times, you've got 4 interruptions, and there might be a cat on your shoulder. So all those pieces are different. Another difference is the focus of what you're talking about. So if you're, in substance abuse treatment, it's pretty clear what you're trying to influence. When you just go in to help a teacher or to help a parent, sometimes you start off with everything is possible. And so part of the skill is getting down and focusing and staying on a topic long enough to actually have a productive conversation around it. I'll also say in school-based work, although sometimes they're just general conversations, oftentimes they're infused in a particular intervention protocol. So sometimes motivational interviewing is just one of multiple things you want people to do well, which just makes it even that much harder. Whereas in a clinical setting, sometimes it's used with other treatments, but mostly if somebody's using motivational interviewing, it is the intervention. Does that help, and how does that fit into the coaching, health-based coaching?
Yeah, we kind of have, I guess, more like of a structured thing. So like students can book like appointments. So like an initial is like the hour kind of that you're talking about, follow-up sessions with the student. And then obviously the topics are like health and wellness. So our scope's really limited in that. So like physical activity, nutrition, stress management, time management stuff. So I was kind of interested to see how like the content, more so the content of the coaching and the types of goals you're setting kind of differ, and maybe your technique possibly.
Yeah, so I don't know if the technique would differ so much, but it sounds like, you know, the structure that they provide for you kind of narrows the scope of what you might be talking about and gives you language to help the other person identify what would be a priority and is most relevant to talk about. So yeah, that makes total sense to me that this is a practice that would inform that process.
Thank you. Andy, do you mind stop sharing?
Oh yeah. No, I have to I have to keep sharing. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. Other questions for Andy? Hannah?
Yeah, I would just love to hear a little bit about your your path kind of to getting to where you are and how you've kind of come to develop the research interests that you have.
Wow, great question. So my path, I started out very behavioral which is a little bit unusual, out of social work as well, but probably influenced both by my interest in school-based practice, which tends to be more behavioral, and then the mentors that I had, which were also more behaviorally based. And then, so I was doing a lot of what I call primarily behaviorally based interventions. Then I think a couple of things happened that really led me in the path that you've heard about today. So one is when I landed at the University of Louisville and didn't know what I was going to teach, about a month before I started teaching, they said, our entire advanced practice sequence is based on narrative therapy, and we'd like you to teach that class and then chair the sequence. And I was like, really? Narrative therapy? All right. Had not really ever heard of it. And it is about the opposite of behavioral practice. It's got some Rogerian type things, but it's very kind of, I would say, it's intentional, but it's, pretty loose, and it's not about behavior and very, very much talk therapy. I ended up really enjoying the practice, and it really kind of shaped how I interact with people. And then the second piece that really influenced the motivational interviewing was I was writing some grants with some colleagues, and we were, just kind of explore. They have a behaviorally based intervention in the schools that was less effective, particularly for hard to engage families. So we were looking at ways that you could, possibly modify that intervention to increase the effectiveness with that particular population. And one of the colleagues that I was working with, worked with some people that knew motivational interviewing pretty well and brought it up as a possibility. I was a licensed clinical social worker, so I was like, that looks pretty interesting, and I think I probably could pick that up pretty quickly. And so we wrote a grant a couple of times, failed a couple of times, then it got funded, and then I had to immerse myself in this practice, and it really resonated with me, and I enjoyed it, and it's kind of just been a ride, ever since. Like when I graduated with my PhD program, I had never heard of this, which has become kind of like the hallmark of my research agenda with multiple tentacles. So yeah, it's just kind of funny how things, you never know what's coming.
And could you add, where did second step fit into this?
Well, I've done a little bit second step, but this came in with, most of it was with first step, right? Are you talking about,
Oh,
is that
yeah.
what you're, yeah,
Sorry.
those names, yeah, totally, those names. So that was it, with the first step to success. Now first step next is an early intervention, and it's got a school component, and it's changed a little bit. It used to have a whole school component, and it had a home component, and the home component was very psychoeducational and not developed by clinical people. And in hindsight, it is not terribly surprising that you couldn't just walk in with your curriculum about parenting and engage in people that had like really complicated lives and weren't psyched to see somebody from the school talk to them about, their parenting practices. And so then it was John Seeley who came up, who worked with Tom DeShawn, and they had those linkages and said, geez, this might be a possible adaptation for First Step Next. And that's what this grant came out of. So we started down this road, and it became very clear you couldn't just put a little sprinkle of motivational interviewing into what was otherwise a behaviorally based psychoeducational parenting program. So about a year in, we stopped trying to do that and said, man, can we just start from the bottom up with a whole new home component? And so we did. And then that was a development grant. And then the data that we have from Homebase was the follow-up efficacy trial where we had, 400 parent teacher child triads randomly assigned to a control, Homebase only, First Step Next only, and Homebase plus First Step Next.
So if any of you are interested in reading more about that school-based program, First Step and First Step Next, you can do searches for those. There are books and there are journal articles, and there's a good bit on it if you're interested, especially those of you interested in working with young kids.
And if you're having a hard time sleeping and you just want something to knock you out at night, email me. I'll send you a few articles. You'll be gone.
Andy can help us with everything. All right. Are there any other questions? Well, if not, I want to thank you very much, Andy. I appreciate your taking the time to do this and sharing all this information and your background and things. For those, for the students, next week we have another Andy speaking. Next week is Andy De Los Reyes, who, especially if you're in RISE, if Eric Youngstrom is not giving you enough assessment information, Andy will add to it incredibly by giving you even more assessment information. So that's Andy's big area of expertise. So again, thank you much, Andy, for your time today. Appreciate it very much and enjoy your travels.
Thank you very much. Great to see you, Steve and Julie, and nice to meet you, everybody. Good luck on your journey, and don't hesitate to reach out if I can be useful.
Thanks, Andy.
Bye, guys.